Good evening and welcome to the New York Symposium with Diane Sayre. I'm Diane Sayre, LaRouche candidate for U.S. Senate in New York. Today is June 7th, 2024, and this is one day after the 80th anniversary of the successful landing at Normandy, famously known as D-Day, which definitely was a turning point in the war, and in which Russia or the Soviet Union played no small part, but you would never have known that from the delusional and foolish remarks from the US President Biden at the celebration of this, who also didn't know whether there was a chair behind him or not, and various other problems indicating his senility, or the French President Emmanuel Macron. I think it's frankly outrageous that in the last few years, Russia has not been invited to these commemorations because they were our critical ally in defeating Hitler. In fact, if you look at the losses taken by the Soviet Union, 27 million dead, they were the decisive factor in the victory against fascism, but you would never know that today. So I want to take that up. But first, let me just announce that on Wednesday, June 12th, there's going to be an extraordinary international press conference sponsored by the Schiller Institute at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., where Helga Zepp-LaRouche, founder of the Schiller Institute and convener of the International Peace Coalition, will be joined. She will be speaking remotely, but Scott Ritter, former UN weapons inspector, Marine intelligence officer, who is becoming very well known because of the State Department's decision to grab his passport when he was trying to get on an airplane and travel to the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. There you see the press conference announced on the Schiller Institute website. It's Wednesday at 1 p.m. So Scott Ritter will be speaking there. Also, Senator retired Colonel Richard Black from Virginia, Ray McGovern of the founder of the Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, former CIA analyst, and I believe also Steve Starr, who is somewhat of an expert on what happens when a nuclear bomb goes off, which they are trying to disguise now and cover up. And apparently the Department of Energy is investing a lot of money in saying that the idea of the fireball and all of the catastrophic consequences of a nuclear bomb are really being exaggerated. And if people saw the New York City public service announcement, you may believe that if there's a nuclear bomb in Manhattan, all you have to do is quickly get inside your brownstone, remove your contaminated clothing, put it in the laundry, and turn on the radio and wait until you get instructions that it is okay to come outside. So there is a great deal of danger in the pompous delusional quality of some of our Western leaders. I went through some of this last week, but let me reiterate that President Biden gave Ukraine permission to launch strikes using weapons supplied by the United States deep into Russian territory. In the last weeks, there have been 3 different attacks on Russian early warning radar systems, one of which at Armavir apparently did some damage, the extent of which is not known. But you have to realize Russia, unlike the United States, has a no first use doctrine. Russia does not believe in preemptive nuclear war. They have stated in writing the very limited band of conditions under which they would use a nuclear weapon, one of which is if there is an existential threat to Russia. Another is since they depend on deterrence. that is, the purpose of their nuclear weapons is the second strike, that anyone who would think of striking Russia has to know that Russia will respond. But if their ability to respond is hampered because their eyes, i.e., their radar detector systems, have been poked out by the West, that also is a reason why Russia would respond. As Putin has said, Russia will respond to these actions. When I spoke last with Scott Ritter, it was his assessment that Russia is not likely to do something rash like blow up a NATO city or something at the moment, because they have won the war in Ukraine, something else the West is trying to hide, and they don't want to risk that victory by creating a wider war. But if the West continues to press and to destroy Russia's ability to respond to nuclear weapons, then Russia will be forced to respond now. So today was the final day of the St. Petersburg Economic Forum. I understand Scott Ritter did manage to speak there by video. President Putin gave the opening speech in the final conference, the final day there. And you should know this was attended by something like 19 to 25,000 people from over 100 nations. And what Putin said is that the Russian economy is now the fourth largest in the world. It has surpassed even that of Japan. And the reason that this has occurred is that thanks to the brilliant sanctions imposed on Russia by Biden and the UK and other NATO countries, Russia has dramatically increased its trade with the global South, which of course has not bought into all this depopulation nonsense and is growing. So he said that trade with Asia has increased by 60%, trade with Africa has increased by 69%, trade with Ibero-America increased by 42%, and trade with the Middle East has doubled. Putin said both in modern conditions and in the long term, the role, weight, and I dare to say, moreover, the future of states depends on how effectively they can respond to global challenges, realize their internal potential, and use the competitive advantages to neutralize weaknesses, maintain and strengthen partnerships with other countries. So contrary to the line that Russia is isolated, it's actually we who are isolated. It is we who are going bankrupt. It is we who are suffering a complete meltdown. I can tell you from my experience petitioning on the streets of Manhattan and organizing there recently, I have brought up, I know on a number of occasions, that the United States has, as a whole, not merely New York, but the whole country, has eliminated over 90% of our inpatient psychiatric beds from 1958 to the present. Now, some of that, of course, is because we have new medications that help people to cope. People can manage their illnesses and they can live on their own, but that wasn't 90% of them. Some other section of the mentally ill obviously went down to Washington, D.C., and are filling places in the intelligence agencies and the Congress, clearly. And then the rest of them are in the streets of New York. And I have now, both times I've been in a particular area on the West Side, I have felt my life was jeopardized in one case by a crazy person who came into a park, started screaming at the top of their lungs, "I don't want to go to jail," and then picking up all of the heavy metal furniture and throwing it at people. And people had to jump up and leave. And then I was there again, and a different crazy man got up and started screaming at everyone in the square that they should be ashamed of themselves, which I had to say to the person I was with is probably true, but maybe not for the reasons that the man was saying. It's really bizarre when the streets of New York City are like being in the criminal ward of a mental hospital. That's what we have done to ourselves. So I'm saying that it's not merely that we have to stop encouraging war, stop sending money for people to kill each other, stop jeopardizing our own security, and rebuild the United States. But we actually have to have a mission for the good. We actually have to have an idea of hope for the future and a reason to believe that it is of value to invest in the development and the care of each of our human beings. So that brings me back to Normandy, because I'm afraid we've fallen a very long way since that time 80 years ago. And the idea, I happened to watch just maybe the first half of this delightful special I found on YouTube, which was the 20-year anniversary of the Normandy landing with President Eisenhower. I mean, he was no longer president, but former President Dwight Eisenhower and Walter Cronkite. And it was just delightful. It reminded me very much of General MacArthur's reminiscences, because what Eisenhower went through were all the doubts. And you know, when you make a bold move like that you're risking American lives, that even if the landing were phenomenally successful, he was definitely sending our best young men to their deaths. Some of them were going to die in this mission of defeating fascism. And so you have to weigh, what is the risk of this? How do we defeat fascism? What is the risk to mankind of not doing this? And apparently one of his aides leaked to the press the letter that Eisenhower had composed, which he was going to release if the mission failed, in which he took full responsibility, saying, all of this failure, I'm completely responsible. I assume responsibility for this. That's amazing. That's an amazing quality of leadership, which we are lacking today. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to turn it over to Carl Osgood, a longtime friend and collaborator of mine and Lyndon LaRouche, who is going to share with us some of that history, because like so many things that happened in the past that are important, most Americans, particularly younger people, are unaware of the truth of what went on. So Carl, glad to have you, and please go ahead.
Thank you, Diane. Thank you for inviting me to do this. I am going to give really what will only be a thumbnail sketch. Dozens of books have been written about the D-Day and the Normandy campaign, and obviously I can't reproduce all of that. Although the one that sticks out in my head because I read it as a teenager is called The Longest Day by Cornelius Ryan, which was published, I think, about 1960. I read it as a teenager, and it's sort of the anecdotal approach of that book has always been with me, and it was made into a fairly well-known Hollywood movie also. But I think actually what I'm going to start with is not so much not the landing itself, but the actually I'm going to start with the British problem. I think you said at the outset that the D-Day was a turning point in the war. I think the Russians could reasonably make the case that the Battle of Stalingrad was the turning point in the war, which began in August of 1942 and didn't. It took until February of 1943 for the Red Armies to wrap that battle up at tremendous cost. They did destroy the German Sixth Army in the course of that campaign, but that was really the end of the German offensive in the east. But the Russians Stalin had been asking for the Allies to open a Western front from about April of 1942 on, in order to relieve some of the pressure on the Eastern Front. And the man or the who was standing in the way of that was actually the British Empire. Was Churchill. The Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa, was actually Churchill's idea. George Marshall and Eisenhower was actually at the time of Pearl Harbor. Eisenhower was actually the director of the Army War Plans Division. He was working directly under Marshall for that, and they were very familiar with the British problem. Churchill wanted to go into the Mediterranean instead of opening a new front in France. And Marshall was actually opposed to that because he was afraid that it would actually, going into the Mediterranean at any great scale, it would delay opening a new Western front in France. So he was actually opposed to that. And according to one historian, actually, I pulled out one of my other books on D-Day. It's called Decision in Normandy, it was published in 1994. So on the 50th anniversary of D-Day, this book was published, or it was published in favor just before that. And the author actually, what he writes is that Marshall could not accept the British proposals that would shorten, could not accept that the British proposals would shorten the war. Quite the reverse. He remained convinced that their strategy might well lengthen it. It was this fear of the long, torturous approach that would leave his forces in the Pacific, that is, the American forces, beleaguered and neglected for months and perhaps years, that later prompted Marshall's fierce efforts to tie the British to a major offensive against the Germans. And Operation Torch, and then the landings in Sicily in 1943. Torch was November 1942, landing in French-occupied, Vichy French-occupied North Africa. And then there was the Sicilian landings in Sicily in 1943, and then the direct invasion of Italy. Churchill actually wanted to invade the Balkans, and Roosevelt recognized that this was actually that the intent of the British to invade the Balkans was to actually try to maintain their sphere of influence, their imperial sphere of influence, in as far east as possible. And but one of the things that informed Marshall and Eisenhower's outlook, they were both proteges in the 1920s of a general by the name of Fox Connor. They had all served. Connor had served on Pershing's staff, General Pershing's staff in France in 1917, 1918. He became an expert on what it was like to wage war with allies. And during the 20s and 30s, he actually delivered lectures on this. And he basically trained both Marshall and Eisenhower in the 1920s. And in one of these lectures he delivered in 1934 at the Army War College, the subject of the lecture was on unity of direction and unity of command. That is, that all the forces engaged in the war should be fighting for the same objective and under one command. That was the American argument. That was what the Americans demanded in World War I, and this was very difficult to achieve. And what Connor said were some of the lessons that were to be learned from this experience in 1918 was that he said, the ulterior motives of several members of a coalition form the principal obstacle to securing either unity of direction or unity of command. With the exception of America and possibly Belgium, all nations, or rather the politicians of all nations in the World War, were filled with ulterior motives and with grandiose ideas of the compensations, quote unquote, they would obtain at the peace table. It is likely to be so again. With the exception noted, all nations were jockeying for post-war positions. So this is the lessons that Connor drew from the experience of World War I. I mean, he knew, and the Americans military generally knew that all the other parties to the conflict on the Allied side were all empires, and so they were fighting as empires in order to gain something from the conflict, not to bring it to a quick, decisive end, as was the American military outlook even at that time. And Roosevelt himself also, I got a nice quote from Roosevelt also, because Elliot Roosevelt, his son, one of his sons, wrote about this in his book As He Saw It, because Elliot accompanied his father to many of the war planning conferences. And in Cairo, this was, I think, just before the Tehran conference, Elliot Roosevelt noted, he reports that apparently the frictions between British and American commanders, there were a lot of disagreements. They were still fighting over what the Western Front would look like at this time. And apparently there were frictions between the British and American commanders in the China-Burma-India theater that were coming back into the process for planning for planning and making decisions about what the Western Front would look like. Elliot Roosevelt writes that these tensions had contributed to some of the stiffness with which the British were resisting the planned operations in the West. The divergence here was quite simply that the British put no stock whatever in the concept that Chinese could be whipped together into any kind of fighting machine, in contradiction to Stilwell's unproven efforts, and that the British strategy in Burma was one of go slow and go small, as against our strategy of going as fast and as big as we could. Eliot said he offered the comment that at least their military ideas made sense, taken in conjunction with their empire commitments. And then he writes, he quotes his father saying, "Of course they do, but their empire ideas are 19th century, if not 18th or 17th, and we're fighting a 20th century war. Thanks be to God, the balance has shifted somewhat. It's no longer quite a war for survival, but it's a close thing, a very, very close thing. And one of the principal reasons it was a close thing lies in their assumption of the eternity of empire." So that pretty much tells us the American approach to the differences between the American approach and the British approach to fighting the war. And Roosevelt intended to put an end to the British approach, as we have reported numerous times. And I should also note that at the Tehran meeting, I think this discussion occurred just before that, but at the Tehran meeting with Churchill and Stalin, Churchill tried to get Roosevelt to gang up against Stalin to get, again, for the benefit of the British Empire. Roosevelt successfully resisted that. But then Churchill got his way after Roosevelt died. He got his way with Truman, who Churchill induced into giving us the Cold War instead of the kind of post-war reconstruction that Roosevelt had actually envisioned for the post-war and the ending of the colonial system. Now, on the D-Day landings, the D-Day landings were the largest landings in amphibious operation, probably still in history. I think about 100,000 troops were involved. These were American, British, and Canadian troops. I can't give you right now, I can't go through the planning process for the invasion itself because I just didn't get a chance to review that material. But it was long, it was extensive. There was a lot of fighting going on. There were disagreements between the American and British sides about how to actually execute the landings and what the objectives should be. But they eventually came to a plan that they could agree on. Now, if David could bring up map number 1, and I'll show you you can see that. Okay, so you see the 5 beaches. The American beaches on the left side of the picture of the map were Utah Beach, Omaha Beach, and then the British beaches, the British and Canadian beaches were Juno, Gold, and Sword. And the forces were divided into 2 field armies. The first field army was commanded by General Bradley. The second army was commanded by General Montgomery. And the yellow circles that you see there are where the airborne landings took place. The ones that are always written about are the American airborne landings by the 82nd and the 101st Airborne Divisions. And there were some difficulties. The landings began about midnight. There were some difficulties because a lot of the C-47 transport aircraft that were carrying the paratroopers had trouble finding their drop zones. It was dark, there was weather, they had navigational difficulties. So a lot of the paratroopers ended up scattered all over the place. But they took the town of St. Mary Glees by 4:30 in the morning. That is before dawn, before the assault groups hit the beaches. They hit the beaches at 7 o'clock. So when that was what was called H hour. And you can see underneath the arrows for the British beaches, you can see the town of Caen, Caen. Now the British were supposed to take that on the first day, but there was a lot of difficulties. There was the Germans, even though they were caught more or less by surprise for the most part, not completely, but for the most part, the German forces were caught by surprise. But they still managed to put up a very stiff resistance. And the British were unable to take Caen. Not only could they not take it on the first day, I think it was more than a month before they were finally able to capture it. The Americans had a great deal of difficulty at Omaha Beach, very famously, again, because of the stiff German resistance. Now, the Germans had spent months building what they called the Atlantic Wall. You can take the map down now. but it was basically it stretched pretty much along most of the French coast, consisting of concrete barriers, of obstacles on the beach that would tear landing craft apart and make it difficult for troops to actually wade ashore up the beach. Heavy gun emplacements, some of which were still not completed by the time of the landings. But it was all enabled the Germans to put up very stiff resistance. Now, if you could put up map number 2. So if you can see the red line there, we don't see the whole map, I guess. I don't see it all the way to the left. But the red line is where is the approximate disposition of the front line on June 10th. So that's 4 days after the landing. So you can see that the British still have not captured Caen. Now, you can't see it there on the map, but the Americans have made a little bit of progress towards the west, towards the Cherbourg Peninsula. Cherbourg was a very important objective because it was a fully operational port. Until they could capture Cherbourg, the logistics for bringing in reinforcements and bringing additional supplies and equipment had to come through the beaches. And the Allies had actually built something they built a couple of artificial ports called mulberries. The problem was that they were wrecked by a storm I think it was around the 16th or 17th of June. So capturing Cherbourg, that was Bradley's, there you go, yeah. Bradley's objective going west was to go west and then north up into the Cherbourg Peninsula, capture the port of Cherbourg, and then open that up as the port of entry for the logistics for bringing in more troops and bringing in more supplies and equipment for expanding the armies. Now, if you could go to map number 3, please. All right. So this is now June 17th. So this is now 11 days after the landings. What has actually happened here is you can't see it there, but towards the left, Bradley has now actually made it across to the other side of the peninsula, the Cherbourg Peninsula, but the northern part of it is still controlled by the Germans. So he doesn't have Cherbourg yet. But if you look to the central part of the map, you can see that the British still have not captured Caen. So this is now 11 days that they still have not reached their objective that was set for them on the first day. There was a lot of heavy battles here. The Germans were able to disrupt British thrusts towards Caen. There was even one story where I remember, this is actually in the book that I showed you, where the British launched a battalion towards Caen, and the Germans were able to, actually one daring German tank commander was actually able to disrupt the whole thrust of an entire, I think it was a company of tanks, just with his single tank. So it was that very poorly executed. Now, if you go to the next map, number 4, is map number 4 coming up? Well, there it is. Now, at this point, again, you can't see it to the left there, but now by June, this is June 30th. So in June 30th, so Bradley's forces have now captured the entirety of the Cherbourg Peninsula. The port is now in Allied hands, and now is the chance to actually set up for the breakout from Normandy altogether. You bring up map number 5. Anyways, so with the capture of the port of Cherbourg, Eisenhower is now able to set up set up the forces needed to break out. And yeah, there it is. Okay. Again, it's sort of we don't see it all to the left there, but what has now what Bradley did, what Eisenhower and Bradley did was they stood up the Third Army. This was around the end of July 25th, I think. They've stood up the Third Army. They put Patton in command of it. And now what Patton's job is to thrust south and then west. He goes to, we see Le Mans, we see, and then the thrust towards, I can't read it down there, but you see the yellow lines are Patton's Third Army. The orange lines are the First Army, U.S. First Army, and the blue lines are the British and Canadian armies. And so there's a breakout from they actually enveloped the German forces that had been holding the British against the British towards still in Normandy, and they get trapped in something which comes to be called the Falaise Pocket. 60,000 German troops were trapped there and captured once they ran out of ammunition and supplies because they were trapped and encircled and they couldn't do anything. They were cut off from the rest of the German forces. So that's the breakout. They capture American troops march into Paris, I think, by the end of August. And then they move up to the northeast towards the Low Countries, towards Belgium in particular. And so you have to set up. Oh, and then also, I think it came in August or September, where there were additional landings on the French south coast, Mediterranean coast. U.S. 7th Army landed there, and then they thrust north and to the east, and eventually meet up with the what is actually has become the 12th Army Group. The 1st and 2nd Armies and 3rd Armies were all grouped under the 12th Army Group, which was given to Eisenhower, put Bradley in command of that. So they set up for the further battles that would come, the Operation Market Garden, which was a famous, the bridge too far, and then the Battle of the Bulge, and then the thrust into Germany itself through Aachen and on towards central part of Germany, until they meet up with the Russians on the Oder River, I think it was, in April of 1945, and finally bring it into the war. So that's the thumbnail sketch that I can give you, and if you have any questions, I can try to answer them.
Thanks. Well, could you just say something about the war up until that point? Lyndon LaRouche used to say that the British prolonged the war deliberately because they wanted to be sure that FDR was no longer among the living by the time it ended. So what evidence is there of that?
Well, I think I touched on that by talking about the objections of Marshall and Eisenhower to the British plans for the Mediterranean. And they also wanted. I mean, remember the original British plan was for Germany and Russia to fight each other, to destroy each other. That was the British strategic objective in 1939. What messed that up, and Lyndon LaRouche talked about this often, was the fact that the monster that the British had created went west first. Right. First, there was the phony war of 1939 to 1940, and then all of a sudden, this was after the conquest of Poland in September of 1939. So Britain and France declared war on Germany in September 1939. They set up their forces, their forces in France at that time. But then there was the phony war where nothing happened. And then all of a sudden in May 1940, Hitler attacked. He went around the Maginot Line. Of course, there was some problems on the French side because there was a great deal of sympathy in France among the French elites for the Nazis. So they probably really did not fully prepare an adequate defense against a German offensive. So Germany went through Belgium into France. They attacked the Netherlands. They attacked Norway, and by the middle or end of June of 1940, they had pretty much captured all of these territories. And then Hitler began planning what to do next. There was some talk for a while of a German invasion across the Channel into England, which didn't happen because the Germans just didn't have all the resources required to do it. And Hitler was somewhat hesitant to invade England because he was really hoping for England to be an ally of Nazi Germany against Russia. Right?
Now, was there anything specific that would have given him that idea?
Well, I mean, there was, if you look back into the earlier 1930s, there was a lot of sympathy among the British elites. There was the famous case of King Edward VIII, who supposedly abdicated because he wanted to marry a commoner by the name of Wallace Simpson, but he was well known to be a Nazi.
Right.
So there was reason for Hitler and the Nazis to think that the British might be sympathetic to them. And of course, there was the case of Hjalmar Schacht, who was Hitler's finance minister, who was actually the protege of the governor of Bank of England, Montague Norman. It was Schacht who was the one who designed the economic policies that led to the concentration camps. And he worked for the British, actually, and the result at Nuremberg in 1946, when Schacht was acquitted, over the objections of the American and Russian judges, right? Because it was the British and the French judges who voted for acquittal, but it was the Russians and the Russian and the American judges who voted to convict him. But you needed a unanimous vote for conviction, and they didn't get it with Schacht. So he went out. He was able to continue his shenanigans after the war. After that, he didn't die until I think 1970 or 72 or something like that. So in a certain sense, his policies were vindicated.
And that's
So
the Elmar Schacht that the economist Abba Lerner famously said if he had been listened to, Hitler would not have been necessary.
yes, right.
Now, Lyndon LaRouche won his 1971 debate at Queens College.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So there was a lot of reason for. So then after France, I'm trying to think of what came in between. But so Hitler was then after deciding not to invade England, he turned around and started looking at the Soviet Union. He hated the Slavs as much as he hated the Jews, and he wanted to invade. I think early in 1941. The problem was that Mussolini decided he was going to get a piece of the action by invading Greece, but that didn't go so well for the Italians. So Hitler felt he had to intervene in order to save Mussolini's butt in Greece. So that caused a delay in the launching of Operation Barbarossa, which finally kicked off on, was it June 22nd of 1941? Something like that.
Yeah, I'm not sure the exact day.
Yeah, but I think it was right around then. So a big and caught the Soviets pretty much by surprise. I mean, according to the histories that I've read, Stalin was pretty much in shock for the first several days after that, after the Germans launched their offensive. But then he slowly came around and started pulling together the Red Armies in order to counter the German thrust. But the Germans made it by November, had made it almost to the gates of Moscow. They could apparently see the domes of the Kremlin. That they were that close, but they didn't make it in. So the Red Army was able to finally stop them there before they could get into Moscow. But Leningrad was under siege, as it would be for 900 days. The devastation there was just incredible. I think about 2 or 3 million people died there. Hitler had actually given orders for the city to be razed to the ground, and everybody in it killed. I mean, I don't know if people think about that today. What this mean? And Vladimir Putin's family was there, and
Right.
many of his right. So even though he was not born until afterwards, this was very much a part of his family history.
I
And
think his
people don't.
older brother starved to death. And
Mm-hmm,
I remember somewhere he was telling a story about this. His older brother had died of starvation, and his mother was nearly dead, and I guess they had crews of people coming through picking up the dead, and they tried to carry his mother off in a stretcher, and his
mm-hmm.
father stopped them and saved her life, nursed her back to health. Putin was born later, but imagine having that in your family and then what it would mean for the West to be arming and promoting Nazism. And I think it was only the US, Israel, and Ukraine, I might be wrong, when the Russians introduced the resolution at the UN to condemn the glorification of Nazism, who
Yeah, I
voted
know it was.
against
Yeah,
that.
I know it was Israel, and I don't know about Israel, but I do know about Ukraine and the U.S. voting against that resolution. I'm not sure. I don't know. I don't know if
Yeah,
offhand
I'm
if it was.
not sure. It would make sense since Bibi Netanyahu was definitely in the tradition of Adolf Hitler,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
the
Right.
IDF is trained according to their methods.
Right. Mm-hmm. But the turning point at Stalingrad came with Operation Uranus, as the Red Army General Staff called it, was the operation to encircle the Sixth Army, the German Sixth Army, and cut them off from their logistics supply lines. And that took a couple of months, but it worked. and then they were finally able to drive. They captured the Sixth Army. Something like 90,000 German troops surrendered, including the commander, General Paulus, who later turned against Hitler.
Hmm.
Although some historians might argue that it was because he was under the influence of his captors. But in any case, that's what happened. And then came the Battle of Kursk, the largest tank battle in military history, and the Soviets never looked back. The Red Army never looked back. They were in Poland, I think, I forget the exact date, but I think it was by earlier mid 1944. They were in Poland. So and then the D-Day landings happened, and you had the opening of the Western Front. But I want to say something. I should probably go back to Italy for a second, because Italy and the Balkans, because Churchill kept insisting that this was Europe's underbelly, soft underbelly, and it turned out that the Italian campaign proved that it was anything but soft. It was actually a very difficult campaign that absorbed a lot of troops. It was very risky for the Allied troops that were fighting it. The Germans were very deeply entrenched in Italy. Even after the Italians basically came out of the war, this was still a very difficult campaign. And so it obviously absorbed a lot of resources that could have been used in opening a second front in France. And it would have been more if if Churchill had gotten his way in the Balkans.
Mm.
Because this is very difficult mountainous terrain. You can't really drive uh, uh, heavy armored columns very easily through the mountains.
Right.
Right.
Now, what are your thoughts about why this is relevant, why Americans should know this history, and why President Putin took such pains on the 75th anniversary of VE Day to write this long history of World War II and began releasing all kinds of documents that had been classified?
Well, because Americans need to know the real story of the war and how it actually began. Franklin Roosevelt was against fascism. Now we have a president who's as demented as he is for fascism, is fighting with fascists, and under the control of fascist financial interests. These are the same interests that ran the British Empire, that sponsored the Nazis during World War II, or actually in the 1930s. Actually, there were fascist movements all over Europe in the 1920s and 30s, but they were all basically run out of London and through their oligarchical networks in Europe. The same networks, or the current new generation of the same networks, are still active today, and they still are intent on doing the same thing that they did in the 20s and 30s. And the British Empire basically has hated Russia for 200 years. And what in that article that you referred to, what Putin was actually pointing towards was the dirty role, in particular, that Poland played in the 1938 crisis in Czechoslovakia. Because you're right, you had Hitler was stirring up what they were called the Sudeten Germans. And Hitler had this idea of Greater Germany, of Lebensraum, of incorporating all the German-speaking peoples into Greater Germany. And the Sudeten Germans were German speakers who were left in Czechoslovakia by the redrawing of borders in 1919 at the Versailles Treaty. And then I'm trying to remember the sequence. 1938. Yeah, I think he did Austria first, right? The Anschluss of Austria. And then he began looking at the Sudeten region of Czechoslovakia. And this was important because that was the road, at least this is how it was looked at in 1938, that was the road for German forces to invade the Soviet Union, was through Czechoslovakia. And Stalin saw this coming. He knew what was happening and tried to organize an anti-Hitler pact in order to cut that corridor off from Germany, to prevent trying to prevent a war. France was interested, but the French wouldn't do anything unless the British did. And the Poles but for Soviet troops to defend Czechoslovakia, they would have had to go through Poland, and the Poles were not going to allow that to happen. One of the reasons why was because they had interests in parts of Czechoslovakia themselves, which they took a few months after the Sudetenland was taken over by Germany, after the sellout of Czechoslovakia. And so Putin wrote about this from the Soviet archives, but this was confirmed also in a reading of the American documents from the same period, confirmed that what Putin had written was actually the case. That this is what was happening. That Poland was playing a dirty role because there were fascists in Poland, and there was also anti-Semitism in Poland, which is very similar to the Nazi anti-Semitism. So they were not inclined to defend Czechoslovakia because for these reasons. And this is what Putin documented in the Poles in 2020. I guess that's when the article came out. I'm trying to remember the exact date. I wrote about it, but I have a hard time with dates, remembering the dates. But the Poles went berserk. They went totally insane that because they were insisting, and this is what Putin was responding to. The Poles were insisting that it was the Hitler-Stalin pact that started the war. That was the real start of the war. Well, Poland had made its own deals with Nazi Germany earlier than that, in 34, 35, and so had several other countries, including the British. Stalin was trying to organize an anti-Hitler pact and couldn't do it. They wouldn't agree to it. Particularly the British would not agree to it. And this is what Putin was documenting, this actual history. Americans need to know this history. They need to know who the bad guys really are.
Right. This is really important because, at the debate I attended recently between Alan Dershowitz and Glenn Greenwald and the whole thing was absurd and all the more disgusting and sadistic in that the debate occurred, I think, the day after the very suspicious helicopter crash killed the president of Iran and his foreign minister. And the debate was, should the U.S. preemptively destroy Iranian nuclear research facilities? I mean, what an idiotic question. And I thought, frankly, while Greenwald made certain very legitimate arguments about why not, what neither of them addressed was the relationship between Iran and Russia right now. But at the beginning, Dershowitz was arguing for this, and he said that the reason is that had the United States and Britain bombed Germany for violating the terms of the Versailles Agreement, Hitler would have never come to power. Now think about that, because it was the terms of the Versailles Agreement that made it possible for Hitler to come to power, that created this desperation because they were looting Germany. And, really, if they didn't want Hitler to come to power, they shouldn't have financed him and scraped him up off the floor out of the dustbin of history when he was his party.
The beer hall pooch.
Exactly. But do you want to say something about this argument of Dershowitz?
Well, I'm not familiar with this particular argument. I haven't heard it before, and I was not aware of the Dershowitz-Greenwald debate. But it's bombing Iran like that is totally crazy because you have to look at the entire recent modern history of Iran and the U.S. and British relationship to it. That basically it was the Americans and the British, in particular the British, that created that set the conditions for the Islamic Revolution of 1979, going back to the overthrow of Mossadegh in 1953, which was run by the British with certain collaborators like Kermit Roosevelt from the CIA. But the Mossadegh had nationalized the Iranian oil company, which was controlled by the British. The British hated; they were extremely upset about that, and so they decided to run a coup and remove the elected government of Iran and replace it with a regime run by the Shah. So that marginalized the secular part of this. I forget what it was called. Mossadegh's party was basically marginalized by that. It still existed after the coup, but it was out of power and it was marginalized and actually gave room for the Islamic fundamentalists to rise up. So the current situation could have prevented by not running the coup against Mossadegh in 1953.
Right.
Right. That's another part of the history that Americans need to know. And they don't, they don't, this is all documented now that this is what happened. right?
Well, also, I mean, the current situation in Ukraine could have prevented if Obama and Victoria Nuland didn't overthrow the government of
Absolutely.
Ukraine.
Absolutely. It's the same damn thing,
Right, right.
right?
Yes,
It's it's the imperialism that Roosevelt attacked and intended to eliminate from the world had he lived.
yeah,
And had he lived another 5 years, the world would be an entirely different place today.
right.
A much happier place, I think.
Yes. Now, someone has written, "Thank God Bibi is not fascist." I hope they're being sarcastic.
Yeah, right.
He is, I don't know what it is that we support these Nazi-like twins between Zelensky and Bibi Netanyahu. They're very similar in their approach,
Hmm.
although since the Palestinian population has been looted for so long, it's uh, easier for Bibi Netanyahu to wipe them out. Zelensky doesn't have a chance of defeating Russia. Uh, so again, it's really dangerous. I think we've come to the end. Carl, what are your closing thoughts that you would like to share with people?
Well, I think if people don't believe that the Israelis use Nazi methods, I think the story of the history of the Israeli assassination, uh, the use of assassinations, because in the 1960s they actually hired Otto Skorzeny, who was Hitler's top special operations operative, to assassinate German rocket scientists who were working with Egypt. They actually hired a Nazi to do that. And so that's a Nazi, again, that's a Nazi policy, but it's also something that it shows the it's a kind of degeneracy that dates back to the Roman Empire because assassination was a regular political tool in the Roman Empire. So that's what it goes, that's what it goes back to. So it's that kind of barbarism that we have to eliminate from human society, from civilization. It's not unique to Netanyahu by any means, but it points up the imperial problem that we've always been opposed to.
Right. And that is why we really need to get to a new paradigm. And as MacArthur said, once mankind has the means to annihilate itself, which we now possess, then you really have to come up with a means other than war. And frankly, there aren't conflicts. I was struck last night, I was at a rehearsal of the Schiller Institute NYC chorus. And the chorus right now is singing music in Chinese, Russian, German, English, and the dialect of the African American spirituals. And the chorus has members, being in New York City, which has people from so many countries. So there are people in the chorus from Holland, from Russia, from China, from all over the world. And it's so much fun because people all start laughing and comparing what words are in their languages. And you see, it's really natural that human beings would re kind of delight in discovering our likenesses and our differences. War is not a natural state for human beings. It's really induced by people who have ulterior motives, and they spend a lot of money and effort to get people into that frame of mind where they think they actually don't love other human beings. So this has to be reversed. I think the crisis, how close we are to provoking a nuclear war, is becoming more sensuous to people, and we really have to mobilize. So once again, I just like to, and maybe Dave, you can put that release up again for the press conference Wednesday. I really want to encourage people to go to the Schiller Institute website. You can watch it remotely. It will be broadcast live. If you are with the press or have friends in the press in Washington, D.C., they can attend in person. There's a link there to register. Uh, we're pulling out all the stops. This we've got to pull ourselves back from the brink, and the United States has to return to its intended identity. Now, one other thing about Israel, I will say, is that they are definitely meddling in the US election. They are pouring tons of money through AIPAC, which should register as a foreign agent of influence, into various congressional races, trying to influence the outcome of the American elections. And there's a lot more dirty tricks going on, which I may spend some time on next week. What's happening with the New York Board of Elections, which, to say it's corrupt would be the understatement of the century. And however bad people may think it is, it's actually infinitely worse. And maybe what's going on there, I can't even say all of here. We may have to do the program on Rumble, but I would like to do something about that. So please, everybody, stick with the campaign. Join me next week. Send a donation, please, or sign up to volunteer your time. We have to break out. I was also just want to say I was at a wonderful event in the Bronx last night with Jose Vega. He and I, between us, filed about 80,000 signatures to get on the ballot in New York. We're the only combination of people that did anything like that without having a super PAC and millions of dollars. And I think it shows that people are hungry for these ideas. So thank you, Carl. Thank you, everyone, for listening. And now is not the time to take a vacation, but to mobilize.